Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we've got a really interesting show today because we've got a woman who's going to talk to us about grief care and practices and rituals. But one of the important things about her is she has had parent loss. And Heidi, as you know, adult parent loss is one of the largest visits we have on Open to Hope.
Absolutely. Parent loss while you're an adult is our number one most searched for topic, which is interesting. I didn't know it would be. And today, our guest, Carla Fernandez, is going to talk to us about a group that loses parents that is really minimized. And that's, she'll tell us more about who that is and what group that is. So, like you said, Mom, we're going to be talking today about grief practices and rituals. Carla Fernandez was shaped by her own experience with the death of her father. She is co-founder of The Dinner Party, a national network of peer support circles for young adult grievers, which was featured in the New York Times, NPR, and Oprah Daily. And she is the author of the book Renegade Grief. Can you show us that, Carla? I know you have it with you, which I love.
Sure can.
There it is, a guide to the wild ride of life after loss, Renegade Grief. I love that name. Welcome to our podcast, Carla.
Thank you, Heidi and Gloria. So happy to be here and get to connect with you.
Tell us a little bit about the death of your dad and what your response was and what you found out about the world.
Sure. So my dad, Jose Fernandez, was an amazing person and so much to say about his life. And I think in this moment I will share about his death. He was diagnosed with brain cancer, with glioblastoma multiforme when I was 20, and he had about 11 months. He had about a year between diagnosis and death, which is common for that type of cancer. And I had the privilege of being in a place in my life where I could move from my college dorm into his apartment with him and be a part of his care team. And after he died, I sort of had this Goldilocks experience of searching for grief support that would scratch the itch or tend to the longing that I had. And while I love present tense, my therapist, I felt like I also needed a place that wasn't me and one person monologuing, but people who I could connect to as peers. I did go to traditional grief support, and while I found that helpful, oftentimes I was the youngest person in the grief support group who had experienced the loss of a parent. Many people were, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, mourning the death of a parent who had been in their 70s, 80s, 90s. And as a 21-year-old, that kind of amplified the loneliness that I felt in my grief. And I also noticed that despite the fact that this is something that every single human being on earth will go through, oftentimes the conversations I found myself in were stunted or felt awkward, or that there wasn't a lot of cultural fluency or comfort around talking about grief, which is what drew me to host this dinner party one night for other young adults who'd also experienced a loss, so that we could make the stories of our grief the kind of the main dish of the conversation, so to speak. And that became this.
How long after your dad's death did you do that?
So it was, my dad died on New Year's Day. And I think we had the first dinner in August or September of that year. And I think because he was, terminally ill, I had time to kind of anticipatorily grieve, to reflect on what I might need on the other side. And my dad was really into food and wine. His grandparents had owned a restaurant. He worked in the wine business, and the dinner table was really the place where I missed him the most and where I felt my grief the most acutely. So it also made sense to be the place that I would turn to find the kinds of conversations and connections and memories that I missed having with him.
I love that, Carla. And you were 20, you said, when he died?
20, I just turned 21.
Okay, so I was 20 when my brother died. I like, and I felt my grief was very minimized because I wasn't living at home and I was a young adult. I felt very overlooked and unacknowledged. And I feel like what you were saying before our show is that there's this group of young adults that are too young to lose their parents, basically. and it's not in the normal life course because your friends still have their parents. And yet that group wasn't really being acknowledged, et cetera. It sounds like there is this group that's kind of minimized. Would you say that?
Yeah, I remember at the time, and this has been corroborated with other members that have been a part of our community, that there are incredible resources for kids who are grieving, places like the Dougie Center in Portland or camps specifically for bereaved children. And then there's more traditional grief support centers that are often filled with people that are, maybe losing a parent at a more natural time in life. But there was this sort of 20s to early 30 something demographic that, didn't really fit in either of those categories. And
Yeah.
that's who the dinner party was really created to serve. And currently we welcome people into our community who are in that age range of sort of 20 to mid 40s, who maybe don't have a family yet of their own, but no longer live at home with family and are kind of in this in-between era and generation. And as our work has grown, the community is much broader than just people who've experienced a parent loss, although that was sort of the original impetus for the first table.
So now if I had had my brother die and I was 20 and it was today, would I be able to go to the dinner party?
Yep, we have
Awesome.
tables for sibling loss and tables virtual and tables that are city specific in case you are wanting to meet up with people in person.
I love that, all connected with food. And I've had heard people have some nice rituals where they have people bring the favorite dish of the loved one or their favorite dish and get together and talk about it over dinner. But now, would a dinner party, did you continue on with that then after your first party?
So the first party, while it felt kind of nervous making and felt like a first date, it was a total smashing success. And that original table continued to meet monthly for about a year. And after that first year, we started to hear from friends and friends of friends that they wanted to join. And we were like, what do you mean? It's just a dinner party. It's not rocket science. But what we realized was that it's not that there's sort of a cultural understanding that people didn't want to talk about grief and loss. What we were learning was that they were so hungry to go there. They just hadn't had the type of invitation that made them feel welcome or excited to drop into that conversation. So it was around that time that Lennon Flowers, my co-founder and our longtime executive director, and I kind of shook hands and decided, let's see what this thing might want to be. And fast forward lots of years of hard work that Lennon was really the leader of. We are now a community of about 20,000 people across the country who gather virtually or in person for these reoccurring peer support circles that we refer to as tables.
I love this, Carla. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about your book, Renegade Grief.
Sure. So very early on in some of those original conversations, I remember hearing stories of rituals or care practices that other people my age were finding helpful. Some of them were rituals rehydrated from their own ancestral traditions. Some of them were kind of creative experiments and art projects. But as someone who kind of felt like, where was the guidebook to land on my desk after my dad died to give me some ideas around how to turn grief, not from a noun, a thing that I'm distancing myself from, but grief as a verb, the sort of essential process that we go through to make sense of our mortality and the mortality of the people that we love. I was so hungry for these types of rituals and care practices. So I kept hearing stories of people my age who were figuring out their own way to that type of tending to their grief. And that really became the kind of spine of this book, Renegade Grief. So each chapter is its own care practice profile. And the sort of wrapper of the book, this title, Renegade Grief, is really, to me, the big shift, the narrative shift that we need in the grief field of transitioning how we relate to grief as something to get over, to move past, a noun that we're distancing ourselves from, and to actually care for our grief well in the culture that we live in today. You kind of have to be a little bit of an outlaw. You have to be a little creative. You have to defy the status quo that would have you ignore your grief or not talk about the person ever again. So that's sort of my invitation in this book is how do we relate to grief as a creative practice, and how do we find the people who could kind of be a part of this with us?
Give us some rituals and practices that you particularly like.
So the book is structured around these three main buckets. There's a collection of rituals that are all about honoring your past with the person. There's a bucket of rituals all about being present with your grief. And then the final section is all about how do you weave the story of grief into your future. And within each of those, there's probably 8 different care practices that you can explore. And some of my favorites that I've heard over the years that ended up on the pages of the book are one of the dinner partiers writes a letter to her dad every year who passed away and puts the letter in a bottle and throws it into the Hudson River near where she lives. And I thought that was such a fun way to maintain a connection with her dad, who was a really man who loved the ocean. That's one of many that are in here. And my hope with the book is that people read it and it doesn't necessarily provide specific steps to follow, but there are stories to inspire your own version of arriving at that kind of a care practice or ritual.
Yeah, I love, there's a ritual, maybe you have one of these in the book, that I've used a lot with clients, and that is having them write a letter and having even a group, and you can visit the cemetery and read the letters or poems or singing or whatever, and you can write them on paper and then burn the paper and then use it for mulch in a rose tree or a tree or something with, all those memories in it.
Beautiful. I love that.
I like that. The other thing I like about story, Carla, is not only do you learn coping tools and rituals, but it normalizes what you're going through and you feel like you're not alone. And you recognize yourself in all these stories.
It's true. Yeah, that's a sort of, at the end of the day, the research that we've done to kind of understand what's happening around the dinner party table is telling us that the big, powerful impact to people is this experience of normalization. It's not that they need, 10 steps to go through. What they really need is someone looking across the table at them saying, me too. We all know the power of those words now more than ever. And people get that experience within the dinner party. And my hope is that throughout the book, there are ways of taking these care practices and doing them personally, but also doing them collectively. Gloria, I love your example of creating the mulch to plant a tree together. Feels like a perfect example of that.
I was wondering, how long has it been since your dad died?
Just over 15 years.
Yeah. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about your journey, because you're still doing it, aren't you, with this book?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that in many ways I wrote the book that I both wish that someone had given me when I was 21 and he died, and that also I continue to need as someone who is grieving other losses and continuing to render to the reality that my dad is somehow still dead after all of these years, as it seems to be. Yeah, and so it's been part of creating this book was definitely about having to kind of like relive some of my own memories, make sense of how I've tended to my own grief, in some ways how I have not. And yeah, it continues to be kind of a roadmap that I think I will be using too.
Being able to talk about Jose and my son Scott and my deceased husband Phil, being able to say their name out in public and use those stories is so kind of amazing.
Mm.
Well, and I think that Carla is an example of how our loss doesn't have a beginning and an ending, because Carla is in a different life stage right now, but she misses her dad for different reasons, is what I'm going to guess. At
Totally.
this stage of your life. I created a class called Traumatic Loss During Childhood, which looks at how our losses impact us over our entire life course. And I think you're a great example of that. It's like, yes, you're in maybe not as painful a place, but you miss your dad for very different reasons today, I'm guessing.
It's true. Yeah, I wrote a chapter about navigating big days, which we talk about a lot in the grief space. And I got married a year and a half ago. And that was like the big bad boss of the father loss grief experience, was the sort of questions of who would walk me down the aisle and with whom would I have my first dance, and all the questions that are at the root of like what is essentially a ritual where a daughter is given away by her father, whether we agree with the politics of that or not. That's kind of like what the traditional wedding format is designed around.
I know our listeners are wondering who did walk you down the aisle and who did dance with you.
My mom and my brother walked me down the aisle, which was great and so sweet. And then my grandfather, my dad's dad, is still alive, and we did a first dance together, which was really precious.
I imagine also a little bit emotional.
for
Yeah.
sure. But like the kind of emotional that's like we're going through the fire of what could, I also had the choice to kind of skip over that section in the day and not deal with it at all, but it felt important to honor my dad's absence by being thoughtful about how to kind of fill the void. And I'm so lucky that I have other family members who could step up in that way, although it was complex, as life is.
Right.
I love inviting those memories in. Early on, you're kind of afraid you're going to get stuck in the feeling. You do have the feeling, and you wouldn't want to not have the feeling of missing them. You just don't stay there as long, and you're able to recover. But you know, the heart is a beautiful thing that you can keep those memories alive in your body.
You're an example of how you can rebound quicker. You can dance, you can have your grandfather dance with you, you can walk down the aisle. It can be a moment of reflection and tears and a moment of joy also. And early on, it's hard to flip back and forth between those two feelings.
It's true. Yep. I don't know if I could have done that if it was year 5 or year 10, but it was year 13 and I felt ready in that moment. And it was really my friendships with people that I made through the dinner party who had those own sorts of decision points themselves, who I could talk to kind of wade through my options. Thedinnerparty.org, you can shop the sort of available tables, and some of those are in person, some of those are virtual. If you don't see what you're looking for, you can apply to become one of our volunteer hosts and create your own table. And if for whatever reason, like you're outside of our age range, there's other resources available to everybody on the website. And then as a nonprofit co-founder, duty requires me. We're always fundraising to help make sure that this good work continues. So another thing we're always looking for is for folks to sponsor a seat at a table for somebody who can't afford our membership fee.
I love it. And where can people get your book?
So my website is carlafernandez.co, and there's links to all the places where you can buy it online, wherever books are sold. And it's out and ready for you to read it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. I love everything you've done in memory of your dad.
Thanks so much. It's always nice to talk to kindred spirits.
Thanks, Carla, and thanks for building awareness about parent loss and for being the co-founder of a place where people can come together and, get peer support.
My pleasure. Thanks for all the good work that you do at Open to Hope.
And thanks everybody for joining us on the show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.